In preparing for a European war, the British Army had always considered the possibility that it might have to conduct a fighting retreat. In fact, this was one of the scenarios for the 1913 Army manoeuvres, so a significant amount of preparation had been made for that situation. As we now know, the British Expeditionary Force would go on to conduct the Great Retreat, a tactical movement of over 200 miles, in just 2 weeks, fighting a rearguard action the entire way. So how was it done?
The object of a rearguard action was to alleviate the main force from the pressure of the enemy's pursuit and to allow it to retire in good order. To this end, when the British moved out of Mons in August 1914, battalions such as the 4th Royal Fusiliers remained in their defensive positions as long as possible, to allow the rest of the army to retire. For units which had not seen any action, like the 1st Black Watch, this was frustrating and confusing. However, it allowed them to reduce casualties and live to fight another day. The rearguard itself, during the retirement from battle, was usually composed of all 4 arms of service: infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers. The infantry and cavalry provided a screen to hold the enemy back. Cavalry were particularly useful, as they could retire more quickly, and so hold a position until the last minute. Artillery was used to force the enemy to deploy earlier, to reveal their plan, and to generally cause chaos. For example, if the enemy could be forced to deploy into extended order, then their communication and advance would be significantly slowed. The most important duty of these troops was to force the enemy to halt and fight, allowing the main friendly force to get further away. However, for every moment they delayed, the enemy's reinforcements drew closer, and so a fine line had to be walked by officers when deciding when to retire again. Ideally, the aim was to keep the enemy at a great enough distance to prevent the main body of troops from being shelled. At all times, as great a show of force as possible was to be displayed, in order to convince the enemy that they faced a larger force, and so rapid rifle fire and machine guns were frequently used. Basically, if the British Army were to retreat, it would do so on its own terms. The job of the attached engineers was perhaps the most important. While the infantry and cavalry held the enemy back, the engineers were tasked with building obstacles and carrying out demolitions to make the enemy's pursuit as difficult as possible. The field service regulations suggest that retiring troops could block narrow roads using wagons with the wheels removed, or by felling trees. They could prevent the enemy from using fords by throwing in ploughs, harrows, or other sharp objects, prevent rivers from being crossed by sinking boats on the far bank and demolishing bridges, and destroy any useful resources by setting fire to woods, villages, and crops. This final measure was intended to create smoke to hide the positions of retiring troops, as well as to deny any resources to the enemy. However, this method was not often used in 1914, as the British did not want to damage the countries of their allies. The rearguard was to be equipped lightly, with packs and tools carried on transport with the main body of troops. This made it easier to retreat quickly, but also meant that the rearguard had to be relieved frequently, as they could only carry a small amount of food and water, particularly in the case of the infantry section. It's all very well to talk about the theory of how a rearguard action was to be carried out, but what was the fighting actually like for the soldiers on the ground? At the lowest level, tactics employed were similar to the advance and assault, but in reverse. Mutual support between units was more important than ever, and companies, platoons and sections usually retired alternately, while others covered their retreat. It was also common for these smaller units to retire, leaving behind a small body of men to cover their retreat. This was where the use of rapid fire really came into its own, as the aim was to convince the enemy that the entire unit was still in position. The men who remained behind were selected from the fittest men of the unit to give them a fighting chance of getting away. Machine guns were again very useful, but, as the 1914 Manual of Infantry Training warned, machine gunners had to be prepared to sacrifice themselves to allow their units to get away. This is exactly what Private Sidney Godley of the 4th Royal Fusiliers did during the Battle of Mons. Fortunately, he survived, and was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. In 1914, The British Expeditionary Force used this method of fighting retreat to withdraw from their positions in Belgium. However, they then had to continue to retreat for over 200 miles. While the main body of the army faced a hard march south, those units, mostly infantry and cavalry, who continued to provide the rearguards, kept up the process of delaying the enemy, often sacrificing themselves to protect their comrades, in what was to become known as the Great Retreat.